The restaurant incident. The night had started like any other, or at least that was how it seemed on the surface. The Crystal Ivy, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan, glowed with golden light spilling through tall windows onto the busy street below. Inside, the chandeliers shimmered like constellations trapped in crystal, each table dressed in crisp white linens that gleamed beneath soft candlelight. The air carried the quiet hum of success, businessmen discussing investments over wine, families celebrating anniversaries, couples whispering in corners, and a team of Japanese investors sitting across from CEO Michael Grant, one of the city's most influential billionaires. The restaurant staff moved like clockwork, each trained to perfection, each smile practiced, every step rehearsed. Among them was Jordan Miles, a man most would barely notice, dressed in the plain uniform of a waiter, apron tied neatly around his waist, carrying polished silver in steady hands. To most, he was invisible, another part of the background that made wealthy evenings run smoothly. But beneath the white apron and calm expression was a life far more complicated, a past that he had buried deep, and a skill set that no guest in that restaurant could have guessed still existed within him. Jordan had learned to blend into silence after years of practice. He worked the night shift without complaint, polishing silverware, resetting tables, moving through the restaurant's rhythm without drawing attention. At 34, he carried the quiet dignity of a man who had faced storms and now chose peace whenever he could find it. He was a single father, raising his 8-year-old daughter, Ava, in a modest apartment in Queens. Every choice he made, every extra hour he worked was tied back to her smile, her future, her safety. Few at the restaurant knew his story, and Jordan preferred it that way. His late wife, Catherine, had passed away years earlier after a long fight with cancer, and since then he had carried the weight of both father and mother, protector and provider. That night, as he polished a set of wine glasses near the back, he thought only of getting through the shift, returning home, and reading Ava her favorite book before bed. But fate has a way of rewriting even the most ordinary evenings. As Grant lifted his glass to toast his guests, a ripple of unease passed through Jordan. He couldn't explain it at first. It was the subtle change in atmosphere, the way 3 men entered the dining hall not with curiosity but with calculation. They did not glance at the menu or scan for open seats. Their eyes locked instantly on Michael Grant, their steps synchronized with an intent that cut through the room's polished charm like a blade through silk. Jordan's pulse quickened. He had seen this kind of movement before, years ago on foreign soil where shadows hid danger and hesitation meant death. The men were not random intruders. They were trained, deliberate, and they were about to strike. The attack unfolded with terrifying speed. The first man, broad-shouldered with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck, lunged at Michael, wrenching him from his chair with violent force. Glass shattered as whiskey spilled across the tablecloth, in amber streaks staining the perfect white like blood. The second attacker slammed a knee into Michael's ribs, forcing a groan of pain from his lips. The third moved to block the only clear exit, his eyes sharp, cold, and calculating. Around them, chaos erupted. Investors shoved back their chairs, some ducking beneath tables, others stumbling toward the walls in fear. One of Michael's assistants toppled with her chair, her eyes darting desperately for an escape. Jordan's body moved before his mind caught up, instinct forged from years of training taking over. The calm waiter vanished in that moment, replaced by the soldier he had once been. He stepped forward with precision, every motion measured, every angle calculated. His hand struck the first attacker's nerve cluster, stealing breath without shattering bone, and as the man staggered, Jordan's elbow followed through, cutting the lights behind his eyes. The second attacker swung wide, expecting panic, but Jordan slipped into the pocket of his movement, clamping down on a pressure point until the man collapsed like a deflated airbag. The third reached for his shirt, perhaps to pull a weapon, but he was too late. Jordan's leg shifted the man's stance away, locking his wrist, stripping the weapon free and driving him headfirst into the marble floor with a sound that silenced even the chaos. 4 seconds. That was all it took. 4 seconds, 3 men, neutralized, and the restaurant frozen in disbelief. The only sound that followed was the sharp, delicate ring of a wine glass still spinning precariously on the edge of a table, the liquid inside trembling like a ticking clock. Jordan stood in the center of the storm, his chest steady, his palms open, his breathing calm. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low and clipped. "I intervened. I don't know them. I'm not hurt." He knew better than to let adrenaline show. For a black man in a room full of cameras and witnesses, transparency was survival. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement controlled. Within minutes, sirens screamed through the night as NYPD vehicles swarmed the street. Officers poured into the Crystal Ivy, weapons drawn, demanding order in the aftermath. Michael Grant clutched a napkin to his split lip, staring at Jordan as though trying to reconcile two conflicting realities. A quiet waiter in a white apron, and an elite operator, capable of dismantling 3 trained men in the blink of an eye. Cameras flashed from guests' phones, and though Jordan tried to retreat into the background, the moment had already escaped his control. Hours later, when hidden angle footage leaked online, the world would see only his silhouette, his movements, like shadows cutting through attackers, his back framed against the falling bodies. By morning, millions of views would crown him the man in the apron, a reluctant hero trapped in the spotlight. But in that moment, Jordan thought only of Ava. He thought of her small hands gripping her school bag, her laughter on the swings, her bright eyes looking to him as her anchor. He could already imagine her classmates pushing the video toward her, whispering, "Is that your dad?" He dreaded the questions, the attention, the fragile line between safety and exposure being crossed. For Jordan, the danger wasn't just the men who had attacked. It was the light now shining on him, the story being told for him by strangers, the risk that came when his name broke free into the world. When he finally returned home, it was Ava who asked the question he feared most. She clutched her tablet, the video already looping across the screen, and with the innocence only children carried, she looked at him and whispered, "Daddy, is that you?" Jordan knelt beside her, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face, a gift from her late mother. He smiled softly, though the weight of the truth pressed heavy on his chest. "Yes, it's me. But I only helped someone who needed it the same way you helped Mrs. Chen carry her groceries." Ava threw her arms around his neck, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I know you're a superhero." And in that embrace, Jordan felt the fragile pane of ice inside him crack just enough to let warmth back in, a reminder that for all his past and all his skill, the only role that truly mattered was being her father. The world might call him a hero, the media might twist his story, but to Ava, he was simply Dad, and for Jordan Miles, that was the only title worth fighting for. The spotlight and the past, by the time dawn broke over Manhattan, the story had already grown beyond anyone's control. What had begun as a violent assault inside a glittering restaurant had transformed overnight into the kind of tale that burned its way through headlines, social feeds, and morning news programs with the speed of wildfire. The video clip, blurry, grainy, caught from the angle of a shaken diner's phone, showed only fragments. 3 attackers converging on billionaire CEO Michael Grant, the sudden emergence of a waiter in a white apron, the impossible precision with which he moved, the collapse of 3 bodies in 4 seconds, and the eerie stillness that followed. It lasted less than 20 seconds, yet it captured something people could not stop watching. Commentators filled in the gaps with speculation, labeling him everything from an angel in disguise to a ghost soldier. Hashtags exploded across platforms, and the name that stuck, the one the internet clung to with relentless fascination, was the man in the apron. It was faceless enough to invite mystery, dramatic enough to hold attention, and ordinary enough to make people wonder if heroes really did walk among them, hidden in plain sight. For Jordan Miles, the man behind the apron, the fame was a curse, not a blessing. When he woke that morning in his modest Queens apartment, he tried to carry on with the small rituals of ordinary life, frying eggs while Ava rubbed sleep from her eyes, folding her school sweater into her backpack, reminding her to finish her orange juice before the bus arrived. But the television in the corner betrayed him. Even with the sound muted, the image on the screen was unmistakable. The Crystal Ivy's golden dining hall, Michael Grant's startled expression, and the silhouette of Jordan himself, back turned, body poised in a way that revealed more than it hid. Ava noticed before he did, her small hand pointing at the screen with wide-eyed recognition. Jordan reached for the remote with a quiet urgency, but it was too late. "Daddy, that's you, isn't it?" she asked again, her voice filled with awe rather than fear. Jordan paused, studying her innocent gaze, and for a moment he wished he could lie, that he could shield her from the truth. But the truth had already found them. He sighed, brushed a hand over her hair, and nodded. "Yes, it's me. But I was only helping. Nothing more." At school that day, Ava became the center of attention. Classmates who had never noticed her before crowded around, shoving phones into her face, showing her the video on repeat. Some whispered admiration, others envy, but all of them carried the kind of energy that made Ava shrink beneath the weight of sudden fame. When she returned home that afternoon, her backpack sagging from one shoulder, she was quieter than usual. Jordan noticed immediately. He sat her down at the kitchen table, her untouched sandwich still wrapped in foil, and asked gently what was wrong. She hesitated, then admitted, "Everyone was asking about you. They said my dad is famous, but I don't want a famous dad. I just want my dad." Those words cut deeper than any knife could because they were true. Jordan had spent years building a quiet, stable life for her, a life away from the storms of his past, and now, with one unavoidable choice inside a restaurant, the storm had found them again. The calls began that evening. First came reporters, their voices too polished, too eager, promising the chance to set the record straight. Then came opportunists, offering interviews, book deals, speaking engagements. Jordan deleted voicemails without listening to the end. But the calls that unsettled him most came from unknown numbers, the kind that spoke with silence when answered. He recognized that silence. It was not the emptiness of a wrong number. It was the quiet of someone listening, measuring, calculating. His instincts told him the attackers at the Crystal Ivy had not been acting alone. What unfolded that night had been planned, and planned violence rarely ended with one failed attempt. Meanwhile, Michael Grant was furious, though not at Jordan. He was furious at the fact that his billion-dollar security detail had failed him so completely, leaving his survival to chance. Or rather, to the hidden skill of a man they had paid minimum wage to carry plates and refill glasses. Grant was a man unaccustomed to vulnerability, a titan of industry who believed money could solve every problem, yet here he was, humiliated before investors, bruised and bandaged, owing his life not to his hired protection but to a man in a waiter's apron. That debt weighed on him in ways he could not ignore. By the following afternoon, he had tracked Jordan down through employment records and sent an invitation, or perhaps a summons. Jordan wanted no part of it. He had survived the battlefield and returned home, not to relive it, but to escape it. Yet the letter on glossy stationery was insistent. Appear at Grant Industries headquarters, 43rd floor, at 3 o'clock sharp. Ava's safety was his first concern, so he arranged for a neighbor to watch her after school, then pulled on his only suit, the one he had worn to Catherine's funeral, and stepped into the mirrored elevator that carried him toward a confrontation he would rather have avoided. The 43rd floor was a palace of glass and power, the kind of place where success was displayed like art. Michael Grant paced behind a desk as long as a limousine, his jaw tight, his bandage still visible. At his side stood Callie Evans, his executive assistant, a woman whose poise suggested she had long since learned how to stand at the center of storms without appearing shaken. She carried a notebook in one hand, a pen in the other, her eyes sharp and observant. "You saved my life," Grant said without preamble, "and for that I owe you, but I need to know, who are you, really?" Jordan answered with the same honesty that had defined his choices since leaving the military. "I'm no one. I just want to raise my daughter and live in peace." Grant frowned, clearly unsatisfied. He was a man used to exchanges, to trades, to everyone wanting something in return. Yet Jordan's refusal to ask for reward or recognition baffled him. "Everyone wants something," Grant pressed. "Money, security, opportunity. Tell me what you want and it's yours." Jordan shook his head. "What I want is simple. I want to come home safe to my daughter every night, that's all." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that marked the collision of two worlds, one built on power and ambition, the other built on love and quiet survival. Callie, standing slightly apart, observed the moment with a kind of recognition in her eyes. She saw not just the refusal, but the integrity behind it, the weight of a man who measured every decision against the innocence of an 8-year-old girl. But the world outside did not rest. Leaks began to spread, whispering that the 3 attackers at the Crystal Ivy were connected to a larger corporate feud, remnants of a company swallowed by Grant's empire. Rumors spoke of debts unpaid, families destroyed, and revenge bought at a price. The pieces fit together like jagged glass, and Jordan understood the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. This would not be the last attempt. Violence like this had momentum. Each failure would only raise the stakes, push the opposition toward cruelty. And if they could not reach Michael Grant directly, they would look for weakness elsewhere, loved ones, assistants, anyone in his orbit. That was how men like this thought. That was the danger that now loomed over every decision. That night, as Jordan tucked Ava into bed, reading from her favorite dinosaur book, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked, "Daddy, are you going to fight again?" He hesitated, searching for words. He could not promise her that danger would never return, but he could promise her something else, something he could control. He pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered, "Tomorrow morning I'll still take you to school." It was not the promise of a warrior, but of a father, and in that moment it was the only truth that mattered. The threat escalates. The city moved forward as if nothing had happened, but beneath its surface, currents of unease ran deep. On the eye, outside, the Crystal Ivy incident was already fading into the endless churn of headlines, another viral video swallowed by the tide of daily news. Yet for those closest to the event, Michael Grant, Callie Evans, and most of all Jordan Miles, the aftershocks had only begun. Jordan returned to his shifts at the restaurant, doing his best to sink back into anonymity, but he knew the illusion could not last. Too many eyes had seen, too many whispers lingered, and danger rarely dissolved simply because one man wished it so. He polished glasses and reset tables with the same quiet precision, but inside his chest, his instincts hummed like taut wire. Something was coming, and when it came, it would not be small. Michael Grant, meanwhile, carried the humiliation of vulnerability like a wound deeper than the split lip that still bore faint bruising. For a man who had built an empire on control, on the certainty that power insulated him from threat, the attack had been more than an ambush. It had been a revelation. He had nearly lost everything in front of international partners, and the bitter truth was that his survival had depended not on wealth or bodyguards, but on a man who preferred to remain invisible. He replayed the footage again and again, searching for flaws in his own judgment, replaying the impossibility of what he saw, a waiter moving like a ghost, like someone who had rehearsed those 4 seconds 1,000 times before. Grant told himself he was angry at his failed security, but what lingered beneath the anger was fear that enemies now knew he could be touched. And fear, for Michael Grant, was unacceptable. Jordan wanted no part of the CEO's troubles. Every night after work, he returned to his modest apartment in Queens, where Ava's laughter became his refuge, her questions about dinosaurs and fairy tales a balm against the noise outside. But even within the safety of their 2-bedroom home, cracks began to form. Ava came home from school one afternoon clutching a flyer her classmates had made with his picture. Grainy, pulled from the video, but recognizable. Across the top they had scrawled real-life superhero. To children it was a game, but to Jordan it was exposure. The more people who connected his face to that moment, the greater the risk. He sat at the kitchen table that evening, staring at the paper long after Ava had gone to bed, his jaw clenched with the knowledge that he could not shield her from everything. It was 3 days later when the illusion of safety shattered completely. Michael Grant had been in his office late at night, reviewing financial reports, when the silence of the glass tower split open with the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bullet tore through the pane just inches from where he stood, shattering glass into a rain of glittering shards. He survived only because he had stepped toward the sink to wash his hands. Security swept the building, but the shooter was gone, leaving behind only a rooftop door marked with words carved into the steel. "This isn't over." The message was as clear as the sound of the shot itself. What had happened at the restaurant had not ended the feud. It had escalated it. The next morning, Michael Grant made the call he had resisted until then. His pride had kept him from admitting weakness, but now survival outweighed pride. He dialed Jordan Miles directly, his voice carrying a weight Jordan had never heard before. "I need you." The words were stripped of arrogance, stripped even of command. They were simply the words of a man who had stared at death through the scope of a rifle and realized his wealth could not buy another heartbeat. Jordan listened in silence, the second hand of his kitchen clock sweeping past the 12. Ava played on the floor nearby, her dolls arrayed in some complicated game only she understood. He weighed the risk, the cost, the truth, that stepping into Grant's world again meant opening doors he had closed long ago. Finally, he spoke. "If I do this, it's under my rules. And when it's done, it ends. No loose ends." Grant's reply was immediate, stripped of hesitation. "Deal." And so, for the first time in years, Jordan Miles returned to the role he had abandoned. Not soldier, not assassin, but protector. He stepped into Grant Industries the following morning with a guest badge clipped to his jacket. The official title printed beneath his name was process consultant, but everyone who looked at him knew the truth. He wasn't there to streamline paperwork. He was there because 3 trained men had failed to kill Michael Grant once, and others had already tried again. The company was a fortress of glass and steel, yet Jordan saw weaknesses everywhere. He walked the halls with sharp eyes, testing fire doors, measuring the distance from Grant's office to the nearest exit, from the exit to the stairwell, from the stairwell to the garage. He noted camera blind spots, visitor passes that never expired, roof doors left unlocked. Each detail was a potential entry point for death. By evening, he had compiled his first report. He sat across from Michael Grant and Callie Evans, reading off the list without embellishment. 17 obvious gaps, he said flatly. Routine routes, blind spots, outdated alarms, doors unsecured. Any one of these could kill you. Grant shifted uncomfortably, unaccustomed to being spoken to without deference, but he knew better than to argue. Jordan's voice carried the certainty of a man who had lived through what others only theorized. Callie scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes flicking up every few moments to study Jordan with something between admiration and curiosity. And then Jordan added, almost as an afterthought, "There's one gap I can't write on paper. When they can't reach you directly, they'll strike what you care about most. That's how this works." He didn't say the name aloud, but both Grant and Callie knew who lingered in his thoughts. Ava. The silence that followed was sharp, each of them understanding the unspoken truth. Protecting Michael Grant meant inviting danger closer to Jordan's daughter. The tension between worlds pulled at him. During the day, he walked through corridors of wealth, charting escape routes and rehearsing scenarios, his body once again a tool of defense. At night, he returned to Queens, where Ava tugged at his sleeve to show him her drawings, where she reminded him not to forget breakfast, where she whispered before bed, "Daddy, are you a superhero for real?" He never knew how to answer, because the truth was too complicated for an 8-year-old. He was no superhero. He was a man trying to balance the impossible, shielding his daughter from a spotlight that refused to dim while guarding another man whose power had painted a target on everyone around him. The first test of his new role came sooner than expected. Only days into restructuring Grant's routines, 2 men were caught in the company's parking garage, crouched beneath his black sedan with tools meant not for repair but for destruction. They said nothing when arrested, But their equipment spoke clearly. Remote detonators, shaped charges, the fingerprints of professionals. Jordan read the scene like a battlefield. Each failed attempt meant the next one would be sharper, smarter, and crueler. He pulled Grant aside onto the balcony of his office, the city sprawling below them, and lowered his voice to a quiet intensity. They won't stop. Every miss gets them closer, and when they realize they can't break you directly, they'll come for what you care about most. Grant said nothing, but a vein pulsed in his neck, an unspoken acknowledgement that Jordan's words carried the weight of inevitability. Through the glass wall, Callie watched, her expression tight, her pen paused above the page. She understood without needing it explained. The danger was no longer confined to one man. It was spreading outward like cracks in glass, threatening to reach anyone in proximity. For Jordan, the escalation meant a choice he had hoped never to face again. He could walk away, retreat back into anonymity, leaving Grant to his wealth and his wars. Or he could step fully into the fire, knowing it would put him and Ava in the crosshairs of men who did not forgive failure. That night, as he stood on the balcony of his apartment while Ava slept, the city's glow reflecting in his eyes, he knew there was no real choice. He had not asked for this war, but it had found him, and to protect the only thing that mattered, his daughter, he would have to fight it on his terms. The wolves in the dark, the air around Michael Grant's world had shifted. It no longer carried the easy confidence of corporate power, the kind that came from stock charts climbing and investors shaking hands in glass towers. Now it was brittle, every boardroom meeting shadowed by the memory of gunfire and the echo of a sniper's bullet through broken glass. Jordan Miles had warned him that the first attempts were only preludes, that violence carried momentum once unleashed, but even he could feel the storm building faster than expected. The attempt in the parking garage had rattled Grant's team, and though executives tried to mask their unease behind polished smiles, Jordan could see it in their shoulders, their darting glances, the way they flinched at sudden noises. Danger was no longer abstract. It was here, circling, waiting for a chance to sink its teeth deeper. Jordan knew waiting would only tighten the noose. To fight this kind of enemy, one had to seize initiative, lure the wolves into the open, and dictate the ground on which the battle would be fought. He presented the idea to Grant and Callie with the calm tone of someone who had rehearsed such strategies before. A staged board meeting at the Westchester estate, deliberately leaked through channels known to be watched, would act as bait. Security on paper would appear thin, tempting enough to draw out an attack. In reality, the grounds would be reshaped into a battlefield under Jordan's design. Lights cut to create zones of darkness, exits locked to funnel intruders, doors left ajar to guide them into choke points where surprise awaited. It was not deception for its own sake, but survival, and though Grant bristled at the thought of being used as bait, he eventually agreed. Pride had to bow to necessity. For Jordan, preparation was ritual. He walked the estate with the precision of an architect, noting every angle of approach, every blind corner, every stairwell and hallway. The chandeliers that hung from high ceilings became more than decoration. In his eyes, they were potential, sources of shadow, reflective surfaces that could reveal movement. The marble floors, polished to a shine, became both hazard and advantage, betraying footsteps but also amplifying sound to his trained ear. He cut lights in specific corridors, left others blazing, and positioned furniture in subtle ways to slow the advance of men who thought they were moving quickly. He was not merely defending a house. He was rewriting it into a trap. But beyond tactics lay the matter of Ava. She was the constant weight on his heart, the anchor that kept every calculation tethered to something human. To fight this battle, he could not leave her within reach of the danger. He arranged for her to stay with Mrs. Chen's sister across the river in New Jersey, telling her only that he had a long night shift and that she would be safe there until morning. She hugged him tightly at the doorway, her arms small but fierce, and whispered as she always did, "Daddy, don't forget breakfast." He smiled, slipped a granola bar into his pocket as if it were armor, and promised her he would be there in the morning. As he watched her disappear inside, the weight of the night ahead pressed heavier, but her faith in him burned like a shield. Callie Evans refused to leave the estate. "If something happens to Michael, I have to be here," she said simply, her calm tone leaving no room for argument. Jordan studied her for a long moment, recognizing both the resolve and the danger in her decision. He handed her a secure phone, explaining a single code word that would open the panic room only after she heard his voice and that code. "Don't open it for anyone else, not even if they sound like me," he warned. Their hands brushed as she accepted it, and though neither spoke of the charge that passed between them, both felt it. Trust was currency in moments like this, and he had just given her his most valuable coin. The hours leading into night stretched with unbearable patience. Security teams moved in patterns Jordan had designed. Cars rotated in the driveway to suggest carelessness. Lights flickered just enough to give the impression of vulnerability. From the outside, the estate seemed like ripe prey, a house holding secrets and power but poorly guarded against real hunters. Inside, however, Jordan waited, his body still, his mind razor-sharp, each breath timed to the rhythm of the dark. He crouched in the shadow of the grand staircase, listening to the whisper of wind through trees, the ticking of the chandelier as it swayed ever so slightly. Every sense reached outward, anticipating. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the wolves arrived. 7 figures slipped through the pines surrounding the estate, moving with practiced formation, their silhouettes cutting through the moonlight like blades. Their leader, a man named Silas Ward, carried the aura of someone shaped by fire and hardened into steel. A scar ran from his ear to his collarbone, his eyes pale and burnt out from too many years near the wrong battles. Once he had been part of Grant's own security, fired for betrayal, now returned with vengeance sharpened by contract money and personal vendetta. His hand signals were crisp, his men staggered with military rhythm, and their weapons gleamed faintly under the stars. Jordan allowed them to enter. One door left slightly ajar drew them inside, their movements silent but not invisible to him. The first intruder stepped into a blind corner, believing it a gap in surveillance. A snap echoed softly as Jordan's elbow drove into his throat, cutting breath and sending him crumpling without a cry. The second followed too close, his nose shattering against a doorframe that Jordan swung with perfect timing. Blood sprayed across the polished floor like red ink spilled over marble. Gunfire cracked from further down the hall, sparks biting into plaster, but Jordan was already moving, sliding across a cabinet, riding gravity down the stairwell to intercept a third man, ending him in a joint lock that slipped him into unconsciousness. Silas halted, his instincts pricking with recognition. He could hear it in the rhythm of the fight, the speed, the precision. This was not random defense. This was someone trained to neutralize, someone who had made an oath not to kill, but who could walk the line with lethal grace. "He's not trying to take us out, he's disabling," Silas muttered to his men, narrowing his pale eyes. He knew the philosophy. He had studied it once himself. His enemy wasn't an amateur. His enemy was a ghost. The battle fractured across the estate. 2 men veered toward the kitchen, finding themselves trapped in a space Jordan had already staged. The refrigerator became cover, the island a pivot point. Their own crossfire turned against them as Jordan shifted through shadows, striking with brutal efficiency until both fell, their weapons clattering across tile. Upstairs, Callie clutched the secure phone inside the panic room, her body trembling though her voice remained steady as she whispered the code word again and again like a prayer. Michael Grant sat beside her, his face pale, sweat tracing lines down his temples. He had built skyscrapers, moved billions across continents, but never had he felt so powerless, his survival balanced on the movements of a man he had once dismissed as a waiter. Finally, the inevitable confrontation came. Jordan met Silas in the grand hall beneath the largest chandelier, light fracturing across marble in shards of brilliance. They circled each other, 2 predators stripped of pretense. Silas struck first, blade flashing, carving a hot line across Jordan's flank that burned with pain. Jordan countered, his elbow driving into ribs, his knee slamming into thigh, his grip twisting for leverage. The fight was brutal, not elegant. Sweat mixed with blood, grunts echoed against stone, every strike traded for another. Silas spat words between blows, his voice ragged with hatred. He stole everything. Men like him leave us with nothing. Jordan's voice remained even, locked onto his opponent's shoulder, never breaking focus. Nothing you do will bring it back. They crashed against a console, a stone figurine toppling and shattering on the floor. Silas fought with iron will, his angles sharp, his endurance frightening, but Jordan adapted, sacrificing an arm for a step inside, taking a strike to deliver one deeper. Fatigue crept into Silas's movements, the rhythm of his attack slowing by fractions of a second. Jordan saw the opening. A feint to the face lifted Silas's guard high, and in that heartbeat, Jordan delivered 3 decisive strikes. 1 to the throat, 1 to the ribs, 1 to the knee. Silas collapsed, gasping, still alive but broken, his body refusing to rise again. Jordan stood over him, chest heaving, blood seeping from his side, but his control never faltered. He had sworn never to cross the line into killing, not since leaving the SEALs, and even now, with every reason to end the man before him, he stayed within that boundary. He pressed cloth to his wound, lifted the secure phone, and spoke the code. A moment later, the panic room door clicked open, revealing Callie's wide eyes and Grant's shaken face. Relief swept the room, but Jordan's expression remained steady, his gaze already shifting toward the remaining men being bound and silenced by arriving reinforcements. The estate was littered with the remnants of battle, broken doors, blood, smeared across marble, bodies cuffed and hauled away by federal agents who arrived at dawn. The wolves had been drawn out, their fangs blunted, their leader broken but still breathing. Yet for Jordan, the night had not been about victory. It had been about survival, about ensuring that when the sun rose over Westchester, Ava would still have her father to walk her to school. And as dawn poured through the fractured glass of the Grand Hall, cold and impartial, Jordan knew the fight was not yet finished. Danger rarely vanished completely. It only retreated, waiting for another chance. The choice and legacy morning came slowly over the estate, its golden light bleeding across the manicured lawns as if reluctant to touch the scars left by the night. The grandeur of Westchester could not hide the truth of what had happened only hours earlier. Splintered doors hung from broken hinges, glass littered the marble floors like frozen rain, and the faint metallic smell of blood lingered in the air despite the frantic work of cleaners and staff. Federal agents crowded the driveway, their black sedans lined up like soldiers at attention, while photographers and reporters swarmed outside the gates, hungry for a glimpse of the story already, making its way through every news channel. Michael Grant stood on the steps, bandage across his lip. Exhaustion etched deep into his face, but behind his eyes burned something fiercer than fatigue: survival, pride, and the knowledge that his empire had almost been brought to its knees. He had been humbled in a way money could not repair. Jordan Miles stood apart from it all, leaning against a column, his white shirt torn and stained crimson where Silas Ward's blade had kissed his side. He had been stitched and patched by medics, though he had refused anything beyond what was necessary. His wounds were not what consumed him. His thoughts stretched across the Hudson River to a small apartment in Queens, where an 8-year-old girl would soon be waking, rubbing her eyes and expecting her father to be there to walk her to school. That simple promise, that ordinary ritual, was the weight that mattered more than any scar or any battle. He had survived not for headlines or gratitude, but for her. Every strike, every decision, every ounce of pain had been endured for the right to keep being her father in the quiet mornings that made life worth living. Inside, Michael Grant demanded explanations from federal agents, his voice sharp though, threaded with fatigue. He wanted assurances, prosecutions, retribution. He wanted to know who had hired Silas Ward, who had funded the operation, who had dared to turn their vendetta into open war against him. The agents gave answers in fragments, speaking of rival corporations, offshore accounts, old betrayals dressed in new contracts. The details mattered to Grant because they fit his world of business and power. But to Jordan, they were noise. He already knew the deeper truth, that violence was never just about names or contracts, that greed and vengeance were hydra-headed, and cutting off one would only cause another to grow. What mattered was not chasing every snake into its hole, but ensuring that those he loved remained untouchable. When Grant finally approached him, his expression carried something Jordan had not seen before, something close to respect. "You saved my life," Grant said quietly, the words almost foreign on his tongue. "Not once, but twice. There's no measure for what I owe you." He gestured toward the city skyline visible beyond the estate's windows. "I can give you more than money. I can give you protection, status, influence, a permanent role at my side. You'd never have to worry about your daughter's future again." His words were sincere, his tone persuasive, but Jordan shook his head before the offer had fully settled in the air. "I don't want status. I don't want influence. I want to be a father. That's all." Grant's jaw tightened, unused to refusal. He was a man accustomed to closing deals, to bending others with the weight of his resources. Yet in Jordan's eyes he saw something immovable, something that no sum could buy, the kind of integrity that held stronger than steel. For the first time, Grant realized that true power did not always roar in boardrooms or echo in markets. Sometimes it was quiet, wrapped in the arms of a child who believed her father was a superhero. Sometimes it was the ability to walk away from the spotlight rather than be consumed by it. Callie Evans, who had witnessed both the chaos and the aftermath, stood silently nearby, her notebook closed for once. She had watched Jordan fight like a shadow in the dark, had seen him bleed and refuse to surrender, and she had watched him turn down everything that most would have begged to receive. In her eyes, there was no disbelief, only understanding. She knew the kind of strength it took to say no, the kind of courage it required to choose family over glory. As Jordan turned to leave, she stopped him with a simple sentence. "You may not want to be a symbol, but you already are one." Her words lingered in the air, heavy but not unkind. Jordan said nothing in reply, because he knew that symbols were dangerous things, and he had no desire to become one. By the time he reached Queens, the sun was high, the streets alive with the noise of ordinary life. He parked his old car, climbed the stairs, and unlocked the apartment door with quiet hands. Inside, Ava sat at the table, her backpack already slung over one shoulder, her hair tied messily in the way she always preferred. She looked up as he entered, her face breaking into a smile that erased every shadow of the night before. "You're late," she said, half teasing. He laughed softly, kissed her forehead, and handed her the granola bar he had carried through battle like a talisman. "Breakfast like I promised." She grinned, tore it open, and together they stepped back into the rhythm of ordinary life. One walk to school, one chapter of routine restored. The days that followed were not free of consequence. The story of the man in the apron refused to die, and though Jordan avoided cameras and refused interviews, his image circulated, debated, mythologized. To some, he was a guardian angel. To others, he was a mystery to be solved. But in his own home, he was neither. He was simply Dad, the one who burned toast on Sundays, who checked homework late at night, who read bedtime stories with voices that made Ava laugh until she fell asleep. That was the role he had chosen, the legacy he wanted to leave. Not headlines, not viral fame, but the quiet certainty that his daughter grew up safe, loved, and free. Michael Grant continued his empire, more cautious now, perhaps wiser, his life forever marked by the knowledge that survival had come not from money, but from the courage of a man who asked for nothing in return. Callie Evans carried her notebook into future meetings, her eyes sharper, her silence heavier with what she knew. And somewhere, in conversations whispered over dinner tables and debated in newsrooms, the story of the man in the apron lingered, proof that sometimes the strongest heroes were not those who sought recognition, but those who walked away from it. For Jordan Miles, legacy was not measured in the battles he had fought or the enemies he had neutralized. It was measured in Ava's laughter, in the mornings he walked her to school, in the nights he tucked her in with promises he could keep. He knew the world would keep spinning with its greed and its violence, its contracts and its vendettas, but within the small circle of his home, there was peace. And peace, he had learned, was the hardest victory to win, and the most important to protect. In the end, he did not need to be remembered as a soldier or a savior. He needed only to be remembered as a father who never stopped choosing his daughter above all else. That was the choice he made. That was his legacy.